Welcome back guys, Jimmy Jules 153 with another Dreams Logic tutorial. Today we'll be looking at how to make a puppet with a charged attack that does more damage and has more effect the longer that you charge it for. You can see that if we don't charge up the attack, it blows down the wall a little bit, whereas if we charge the attack to full, it blows the blocks away further, and it'll do more damage to a puppet too. I'll go ahead and open up the chip for the attack. Now this will look a little daunting at first, but it's just a few small things all working together. The gadgets that are in the default yellow color are the ones that do all the calculating of the charge. The other colored ones are just after effects, so we'll go through these at the end. We'll go through the chip from start to finish, and I'll explain what each of the parts is doing. So for this attack, we're using the triangle button. We've just got a completely default puppet here. This microchip is the only extra thing that we've added to it. We've got the output from the controller sensor on the default puppet going directly into this node on the left here. For a charged attack, we need a gadget that slowly gains signal strength over time. So for this, we're using a timer. We've got our triangle button input going directly into this timer here, which is our charge amount timer. This starts counting up slowly, increasing the signal while we're holding down the triangle button. You can see that the timer signal is plugged directly into the keyframe up the top here. This is our charge up keyframe. So as the attack powers up more, the puppet will transition more into this pose with its arms out. But you could replace this with any pose that you wanted. You can see that as we hold down triangle, the input node lights up, and the timer signal output slowly turns on the keyframe with its arms out. Now we want this power to activate under two circumstances. One, if the charge for the power isn't zero, and two, if the charge reaches capacity, or the player stops holding down triangle. So for number one, if the power of the charge isn't zero, we've just got our charge timer signal plugged into a calculator that's set to greater than zero. So these two gadgets are saying if the charge is greater than zero, so if there's any charge at all. To understand this, we've got to think in percentages. So when the charge timer is halfway through, it'll be outputting a signal of 50%. This calculator takes any signal that's greater than zero and converts it into a signal of 100%. We've got this is the charge greater than zero question plugged into one of the ports on our AND gate. Now for number two, we need to know two simple things. We need to know if the attack charge reaches capacity, and we also need to know if the player is no longer holding down triangle. To know if the player isn't holding down triangle anymore, we've got the triangle input plugged into a NOT gate. So these two gadgets are saying if the player is not holding down the triangle button. We also need to know if the charge for the attack is full. If it is full, we want the attack to fire regardless of whether the player is still holding down the triangle button or not. Because we're using a timer for our charge, when the charge is full, the timer done signal will activate. Now that we know if the player is no longer holding down triangle with our NOT gate, and if the charge completes with our timer done output, we'll plug both of these into an OR gate, because we want the attack to fire if the charge is full or the player stops holding down the triangle button. We've then got this OR gate plugged into the other condition for our AND gate. So to go back to those two circumstances that we needed, one, if the charge for the power isn't zero, and two, if the charge reaches capacity, or the player stops holding down the triangle button, we've now got our functioning charge logic. So that's basically all our charge logic. The rest of it is all sort of just add-ons and things that the character does with the charge. Once all our conditions for the AND gate are met, we've got that output resetting the charge timer so that it's ready to charge up again for the next use. While our player is charging up, we don't want them necessarily to be able to move around. For this, we can use a mover. We want this mover to activate when the power is charging. We've already got the output for this, just when the charge is greater than 0. So we'll plug this greater than 0 directly into our mover, and then as the player is charging and the charge increases, the mover will activate and dampen the player's movement. So these three chips are saying, if the charge of the attack is greater than 0, dampen the player's movement. Once all our conditions are met, the AND gate activates, which is plugged into our active time timer. We'll just focus on these two gadgets for a moment. This is exactly the same setup as we have at the start. Just a timer plugged into a greater than 0 calculator to turn the timer signal into a 100% signal. If we were to plug the timer output directly into some of these gadgets, like the mover for example, the changing signal that comes from the timer going into the power port of the gadget will affect some of the gadget's properties. This is why we're turning our timer's percentage signal into a 100% signal. Once the power gets activated, it stays activated for however long we set our active timer to. This node down the bottom here is taking the power signal and powering on all of these gadgets on the right. We'll go through each of these in a moment. We need something to distribute our charge power to the gadgets that will use it. For this, we're using a signal manipulator. We're using this because it can also store the charge for the attack. If we don't store the charge percentage, we'll lose that charge signal straight away as soon as the power is fired, because our charge timer is being reset at that point. You can see that as soon as we start charging, the signal manipulator on the left starts taking in signal and outputting the signal. But as soon as we fire, the input signal gets completely dropped because our charge timer gets reset, but the output signal stays the same for a moment. You can see that we've got our active timer signal output plugged into the freeze port of the signal manipulator. So as soon as our attack fires, while the attack is active, the output signal will be frozen. So you can see the charge builds up, then as soon as the attack is fired, it freezes that signal for a moment until our attack is no longer active. So these two gadgets at the moment are saying, while the attack is active, hold on to the charge amount. The charge amount is plugged directly into two of our gadgets. The first is the health modifier, which is set to be a zone and is about the same length as the flex that come out of the attack. We've got our modification amount set to 15, so you can see that if we quickly press triangle, it doesn't do much damage. But the longer we hold it, the more the damage amount increases before it activates. This signal manipulator is optional. It's just feeding a minimum 40% signal into our force applier. So even if the player doesn't charge the attack for long, it'll still activate the force applier and push things away a bit. You can see on the left of the signal manipulator that even though it's not getting any input signal, on the right it's outputting a 40% signal. In the force applier, we've got our force speed set to 10 meters per second, and at the moment, it's at 4 from our minimum 40%. To get the minimum 40% signal, we've got our signal manipulator set to the custom remapper option. We've also got it set to clamp values. Our input signal on the left can be anywhere from 0 to 100%, and our output signal on the right can be anywhere from 40 to 100%. You can drag these remapper bars around and change it to whatever you like. With our signal manipulator tweak menu open, we can pop into test mode. You can see that when we hold triangle, our charge timer starts to increase on the left and sends an increasing signal to our signal manipulator. As the input signal on the left increases from 0 to 100%, our output signal on the right increases from our minimum 40% to 100%. Our force applier has the same zone as our health modifier. You can get these zones all nicely aligned to the grid so that they're exactly the same. The next gadget that gets activated is the keyframe with the puppet with its arms out in front. So it goes from our charging pose with its arms pulled back to the pose with its arms out in front when it gets activated. Next is the emitter, which is just emitting some pulsing flecks that are about the same length as our force applier and health modifier zones. Then we've got one more mover. This mover blows the player backwards further the more charge that's built up, just so it feels like the cast has some force to it. You can use an advanced mover to both stop the player from moving while the attack is charging and to force them back when it blasts, but just for readability, I've split this up into two basic movers. And finally, we've got the cooldown for the attack. We want the attack to start cooling down as soon as it gets activated. So we've got this output from our AND gate plugged into this timer's reset port. When this cooldown timer is done, it activates the triangle input so the player can press the button again. As soon as we reset this timer by firing the attack, the input will be deactivated until the timer charges back up again. Because we've got nothing plugged into the timer's start port, it'll start counting back up automatically. You can see that as soon as the attack is fired, the timer deactivates the input port until it's full again. If we try and press the triangle button while the timer isn't full, it won't let the signal through. That's all for this one today, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.